Hi, my name's Travis Pollen, and this presentation is on the pitfalls and practical applications of movement screening. If you're not familiar with my work, I have my diploma in personal training from the National Personal Training Institute of Philadelphia, and I have experience training both general population and young athletes. I also have my master's degree in gait biomechanics, and I'm currently working on my PhD in rehabilitation sciences. Ever since I was first introduced to movement screening about 5 years ago, it's been my guilty pleasure. I've conducted a lot of movement screens and I've read a lot of the research on movement screening for my PhD work, so I'm excited to share what I've learned in this presentation. The presentation will have 4 sections. In the first section, I'll go over the theoretical rationale for movement screening. Then I'll discuss the merits and pitfalls of existing movement screens, the right reasons to screen, and then lastly, how to get the most out of screening. First, the theoretical rationale. Screening is a strategy for detecting a future condition in a person who doesn't currently have signs and symptoms of that condition. So it's kind of like fortune telling. You're looking at a healthy person and you're trying to predict what will happen to them in the future based on the way that they look today. Now, movement screening, when it was first proposed, was framed as an attempt to identify individuals with potential risk factors for injury or decreased performance based on the way that they move. So the idea was that you would screen and look for impairments somewhere along the kinetic chain, which would cause the person's performance to suffer or put them at increased risk of injury. In the case of this skeleton here, it's going into dynamic knee valgus, which could be a mechanism for an ACL injury. Screening is typically applied during the pre-participation period to see if the person is physically prepared to engage in the target activity, be it a sport or training. So in athletics, the pre-participation period would be the preseason, and in a training setting, it would just be the first session. The findings of the screen are then used in an attempt to reduce injury risk through a targeted intervention program. There are lots of examples of movement screens out there. At least a dozen have been published in the scientific literature. The functional movement screen, which was created in 1997 and published in 2006, was the first one that came out in the literature. So it's a series of 7 movements that are designed to grade fundamental movement patterns that are supposed to be key to normal function. There are 3 tests for what they call functional patterning, so that's the deep squat, hurdle step, and inline lunge. 2 tests for mobility, so that's the shoulder mobility and active straight leg raise test, and 2 tests for motor control, or you might also call that stability, and that's the trunk stability push-up and the rotary stability test. Not shown here are 3 accompanying clearing tests that are done purely to see if the person has pain. This is the shoulder impingement test, spinal extension, and spinal flexion tests. I'm not going to explain too much about how the tests are conducted, but I will talk more generally about the concepts involved with doing the screen. Each of the movements are scored on a 0 through 3 scale, where 0 is indicative of pain regardless of the way that they perform the movement. 1 means that they can't perform the movement. 2 is that they can perform it but with some sort of compensation. And 3, that they perform the movement as directed. Generally speaking, a 2 is considered good enough that you can load that movement pattern. So if you take all of the tests and multiply by the maximum score, you could get a total composite score of 21. In addition to the functional movement screen, here are just a few more examples of screens that are out there. There's the 9-test screening battery from 2009. So this was the FMS minus the hurdle step plus 3 additional tests. There's the movement competency screen from 2012. This was a PhD thesis from a student in New Zealand, and it basically took 7 movement patterns and loaded them in 3 different ways. So the first was actually unloaded versions of the movements, so using band assistance. Then they looked at the same movements just with body weight, and then the last thing they did was they added load to each of the movements. So your score would be based on which level of loading that you were proficient in. One of my favorite screens is called the 16-item physical performance measure screening battery. It came out in 2014, And what's unique about this one is that in addition to the subjective quality of movement tests that the previous screens had, this one also has objective quantitative tests. So these would be tests like the broad jump, where you're measuring the distance that the person jumps, or the lumbar endurance test, where you're measuring the time that they're able to hold that position. And then here are the other tests that round this one out. All of that was to show that there are a lot of these movement screens out there, more than just the FMS. I'm going to be talking mostly about the FMS in this presentation for a few reasons. For one thing, it came first. For another, it's the most widely used, either in its prescribed form or some derivative thereof. It's influenced a lot of the development of subsequent screens, and lastly, it has the most research on it. So if you were to search PubMed today, you would get upwards of 150 search results. If you run in the same social media circles as I do, you already know that the FMS is one of those topics that tends to really polarize people. They're either totally for the FMS or they're totally against it. And the middle ground, that it's useful but not a cure-all, isn't popular, probably because it's not as sexy of a position to take, but it's probably right. And that's what I'll try to convince you over the next half hour or so. I should mention here that I'm not FMS certified, so I really have no horse in this race besides the scientific truth. Now for the merits and pitfalls of existing screens. In order for a movement screen or any measurement tool to be useful, it has to be both reliable and valid. So reliability tells you how repeatable or consistent your measurement is. Let's say that I'm screening a person with a great squat. If a screen is reliable, I have to give that person the same score every time that I screen them. And then if a colleague of mine is screening that person, my colleague also has to give him the person that we're screening the same score as I would give them. And that's all assuming that the person who's doing the squat performs the squat with the same score every time. Now, validity tells you whether your measurement tool is actually measuring what it intends to measure. So as an analogy, imagine that a bullseye means that the measurement is perfectly valid. If you have good reliability and good validity, that means that you would get a bullseye every time. If you have good reliability but poor validity, that means that you would hit somewhere else on the target consistently, but not the bullseye. And if you had neither good reliability nor good validity, you would be all over the place on the target. The good news about the FMS and other published movement screens is that they have acceptable levels of reliability. Some studies suggest that reliability might improve with performance. So one author recommended that a rater perform at least 100 screens before they consider themselves reliable, but other research has shown that novice raters are just as good as experienced ones. Now, in order to answer the question of validity, we first have to determine what the FMS is actually trying to measure. So, is it trying to measure injury risk, or athletic performance, or movement quality? Let's go through these one at a time. When we think about injury risk, the way that the studies are typically conducted is that they screen a large number of people, like the 60 people here. And their performance looks like this. Higher performers are towards the right and lower performers are towards the left. Then you follow them over a period of, let's say, 6 months, and you see who gets injured. So that would be these 13 red figures. The question is, how good a job did the screen do at separating the groups? And is there some cutoff score that lets you bin people as either being at risk or not at risk? In a perfect world, all of the red people would be to the left of the line, and all of the gray people would be to the right of the line. But as you can see, there's a lot of overlap, reds and grays on both sides. So these are false positives and false negatives. What if we move the cutoff a little bit to the left? As you can see, it doesn't solve the overlap problem. What the researchers will tell you, though, is that you're at an elevated risk of injury if you score below the cutoff. And this is true, but what they don't tell you is that there are all these false positives and false negatives. So, in fact, the FMS actually misses, on average, 3/4 of the people who go on to get hurt. Because of this, the FMS shouldn't even technically be called a screen. A screen, by definition, correctly identifies over 90% of people who sustain an injury. But to keep things simple, I'll keep using the word screen just because that's what everybody calls it. Bottom line though, contrary to its original claim, the FMS should not be used to predict injury, at least not in isolation. It's not actually that surprising that the FMS by itself isn't good at predicting injury. We've known for decades that it's not just one thing that leads to injury, but rather multiple factors. First, you have to have internal risk factors, like movement quality, like we've been talking about, but also age, sex, previous injury, cardiovascular fitness. These are all things that can predispose an athlete to injury, or any individual to injury. And then the predisposed athlete has to be exposed to external risk factors like high training loads, different types of protective equipment, poor playing conditions. These all make the athlete susceptible to injury. And then the inciting event or series of inciting events occurs, which leads to the injury. What's attractive about the FMS is that movement quality is something that we can improve, whereas these other risk factors like age and previous injury, we can't change. But movement quality alone isn't enough to predict injury. If we wanted to predict injury, we would have to incorporate more of these risk factors into a multifactorial model. Now, how about performance? Some studies actually show an association between individual tests on the FMS with athletic performance measures, but in general, the FMS as a whole is not well correlated with athletic performance. And again, would we really expect the FMS to be associated with performance? Because performance is so multifactorial. You need other qualities too, like strength and endurance and sport skill to perform well. So maybe good movement quality might be one component of high performance, but movement quality alone won't make or break high performance. And then the last issue, the validity of the FMS for movement quality. We have to ask ourselves three questions on this subject. First, what is a fundamental movement pattern? What is a dysfunctional movement pattern? And then what are the standards that the tests that we're testing, the movements that we're testing, have to be performed to? In particular, what's so fundamental about these 7 movements? The tests were chosen based on the creators of the FMS's clinical experience as physical therapists, but there was no scientific basis for them. The 7 movements are only a subset of all possible human movements, so they don't tell you how a person would do any other movement besides those 7. In fact, they don't even tell you how the person would do the same 7 movements in other conditions. We know that movement changes with added speed and added load. So what the FMS does is it tests your ability to move at low velocity and low load, but these aren't even the conditions that most injuries occur in. So good movement might be a prerequisite good unloaded bodyweight movement might be a prerequisite for good movement at high speed and load, but good unloaded movement doesn't necessarily guarantee the same at high speed and load. If you wanted to know how somebody performed in those other conditions or contexts, you'd have to test them there too. And if you remember back to what the movement competency screen did, where they progressed from unloaded to bodyweight to loaded movement, that's sort of along the lines of what we're talking about. Another knock on the FMS is that people can actually manipulate their performance based on knowledge of the scoring criteria. So a study of firefighters actually showed that when they knew what the scoring criteria was, they were able to improve their performance by more than 2.5 points. And so this is something we definitely need to be aware of if we're going to be administering movement screens. Lastly, we know that people get better when they practice. So maybe if somebody is not performing well on a movement screen, it's just because they've never done these movements before and they don't have any practice at them. How about movement dysfunction? Suppose you have a person like Dmitry Klokov here, who's actually an Olympic silver medalist in Olympic lifting, who has an overhead squat on the FMS's standard like the one pictured on the left. So according to the FMS, you have to have your feet hip width apart, toes forward, and your hip crease has to go below your knee at the bottom of the squat. Well, when you let him deviate from this rather contrived testing position, so you have him flare his toes out, you put Olympic lifting shoes on him, you let him self-select his stance width, the same guy turns into an Olympic lifting champion when he has 300 pounds over his head. So who are we to call the bodyweight squat on the left dysfunctional? And then the last question, what about these standards that the movements must be performed to? Maybe rather than one specific output, there's actually a range of acceptable movements. So this range would allow for more of the individual variation that comes with the territory of different anatomical differences that people have in their bone structure, like different hip sockets and different limb length ratios. Like if you're tall, you might have longer femurs. And I think if we're not being dogmatic, most of us would agree that the squat on the left and the squat on the right of this continuum are not ideal. While they might not be injurious per se, we don't want them to be our primary or our only movement option, especially when it comes to loading them up in training. And perhaps this is actually what the FMS's scoring criteria captures. If we remember back to what I said earlier, 2s and 3s are generally considered as acceptable, while 1 is not. So maybe that 2-3 range does allow for that acceptable window, and then the 1s would be the unacceptable extremes on either side. So just to give a Cliff's Notes version of what I've talked about so far, movement screening was originally intended to predict injury risk and performance, but because these things are multifactorial, it doesn't do either. Movement screens are not comprehensive, movement changes with contexts, and there is no universally agreed upon movement standard. So that all leads to the question of whether the FMS is useless or not. And if you remember what I said earlier about the middle ground, all of the things that I've been discussing are limitations of movement screening that we need to be aware of, but they don't make screening useless. It can absolutely be a valuable tool, especially if the person has a lot of limitations. It just doesn't tell you everything that you might want to know about the person. What often gets lost in this debate is the underlying qualities that we're testing for. The 7 movements, we have to remember, are just proxies for things like mobility and stability. So if you go back to what each of the tests are measuring, let's take the trunk stability push-up for example. If you have a good trunk stability push-up, that tells me that you have good control of your anterior core. And that's something that I would want a person that I'm training to have. I also want them to have good active hip flexion range of motion, like in the hurdle step. I want them to be able to stand on one leg, to wash and scratch their back, to balance with a narrow base of support. So these are things that are tested in the FMS, and you're free to argue the selection of the tests and the standards and the scoring criteria all you want. But as a personal trainer, these are important qualities to me. What the FMS doesn't tell me is whether the person in front of me is able to use the control that they're demonstrating in the body weight condition in other contexts. So I'd have to test those other contexts too. But at least I know from the FMS that the person has the tools or the foundation to integrate that control into their training and activities of daily living. Traditional orthopedic assessment looked at the parts of the person. So it would look at their isolated muscle strength, it would look at their joint ranges of motion, but then the next step in the assessment process typically looked at performance, things like strength, power, conditioning, and skills outside the gym. There was nothing to bridge the gap between the musculoskeletal function and performance. Well, the problem with that is that the way that people move is greater than the sum of their parts. So you could have great muscle strength and you could have great joint range of motion, but these things might not coordinate well to elicit crisp movement. And that's where movement screening comes into play. If we look at movement first, and if the person in front of us moves well, that also means that their parts are working together and that they're well coordinated. If they don't move well, that means that more testing is needed to determine if it's the person's parts or the coordination of those parts. So the FMS really filled this gap in the assessment process by evaluating movement patterns. And this, on the whole, has been a really positive paradigm shift from looking at parts to looking at whole movement patterns. What the FMS didn't do so well was the scientific method. So when the 7 movements came out, from an injury prediction standpoint, there was no basis besides the 2 creators' clinical experience. They didn't have any scientific evidence that the movements were associated with an increased risk of injury or a decreased performance. So they marketed the FMS and they made claims about the FMS prior to doing any research. And then as the research came out and it turned out that the FMS wasn't as good at predicting injury as they thought it would be and wasn't as good as predicting performance, they sort of backed away from those claims, but they never explicitly stated, to my knowledge, that they were wrong about this and now they think this. They just said, here's what we think now and here's what we're recommending for how the FMS is to be used. But overall, this has led to a lot of confusion on the part of potential users and researchers who continue to research it in a way that it is no longer intended to be used. On to the right reasons to screen. If we're not going to be screening for injury or performance, why would we screen? Well, to me, there are 4 reasons. First, we can determine the movements that we can load in training. Second, we can identify painful movements that we're going to train around. Third, we can establish an individual's movement baseline. And so when I say baseline, I'm talking about their individual baseline, where they are on day 1, not relative to some arbitrarily imposed standard. And then lastly, screening reduces the guesswork and increases professionalism of the intake process. So let's look at each of these one by one. The true purpose of movement screening, to me, is to identify the point along the continuum of each movement pattern that the person currently lies. So it's really about exercise selection. We're looking at each movement on a continuum from unloaded or assisted to body weight to added external load. And so we're looking at a squat, a lunge, pushing, pulling, bending, twisting, and gait, or you might call that locomotion. Remember, the movement doesn't have to be perfect in order to load it, it just has to be good enough. So in the example of a squat, the person might be able to squat with an upright torso with their heels elevated, but not with their feet flat on the ground. So you could give them a goblet squat and have their heels elevated on right away in the training program, and then in between sets, maybe you're working on ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, which is going to take a little bit more time to develop. If they can't do the movement at all, then we're talking about working on the movement skill in an unloaded or an assisted way, like maybe a TRX assisted squat or a PVC hip hinge. What I'm not talking about here is spending a lot of time on the floor, rolling and breathing. I think that stuff does have merit, but if our clients are there to train, then we're not going to be playing pretend physical therapist with them. They have to be up, they have to be moving, they have to be sweating. The second reason to screen is to look for painful movements. So we're going to be training around these painful movements. If we're being honest, if we referred every client who had pain out to a medical professional, we wouldn't have anybody left to train. So in the short term, we're training around these movements. It's the old, if it hurts, don't do it adage. And then sometimes these things will just get better on their own. But if the pain persists, this is when we'll refer the client out to a medical professional. What we don't want to do is try to play doctor because there's a chance that we could miss something that turns out to be serious. With the movement baseline, we're establishing a baseline that gives us something to compare to later and potentially a way to document improvement in movement quality. To answer the question of are we assessing or just guessing, screening reduces the amount of guesswork involved with progressing and regressing exercises in a typical first training session. You could just have them come in on day 1, size them up, and decide to give them back squats. But if it turns out that they don't have enough shoulder external range of motion to hold the bar on their back, then you have to end up regressing the movement. Not only does this waste time during the first training session, but it also makes the client feel unsuccessful because they weren't able to do the version of the movement that you had planned for them. If instead you frame the first session as a time to determine where along the continuum of each movement pattern that the person currently lies, then you can hit the ground running in the first workout with a set of exercises that you're pretty confident that the client will be able to do as written. It also adds professionalism to the intake process, which is something that the training profession as a whole can really benefit from. After the first session, you would send them this nice looking spreadsheet with the findings of the screen and the implications. And this shows that you're respecting the investment that the client's putting into you and you're delivering a super high quality product. The one reason that you absolutely would not want to screen is just for the sake of screening, so just to say that you do it. That is a huge waste of time. If you're going to go and collect all this data, you actually need to use it to inform your programming. Finally, how to get the most out of the screen. When it comes to screening, there are two extremes. On the one extreme, you could do no screen, and on the other extreme, you could do a custom screen. And in between, we have some other options. So we could do an informal screen where we're not writing anything down, we're just watching the way that the person moves, using every exercise as a screen. And I think this is something that trainers should be doing all the time. But when it comes to the first session, I think that newer trainers should use an existing screen and experienced trainers should use a custom screen, tweaking it for their own purposes and making it their own. Here's why. I think new trainers should use an existing screen, such as the FMS, because it's a good starting point. The FMS is quick. You can look at a lot of global or multi-segmental movements in under 15 minutes. It doesn't take up a lot of space, doesn't use a lot of equipment. It's easy to learn, and it helps with communicating with other fitness professionals who are also familiar with it. We have to, of course, remember the limitations of movement screening of the FMS that I've talked about, which are that it's not an injury or performance prediction tool, it's not comprehensive, and it's not the universally agreed upon movement standard. A pro tip, if you do decide to use the FMS, is to save your $180 and just make your own testing kit out of PVC pipe, or you could even do something as simple as putting tape in a door frame for a hurdle step and measuring your distances with a tape measure using a dowel rod or a PVC pipe or even a broomstick for the rod. When we are conducting the screen, we want the implications of the screen to be for exercise selection and loading parameters, not injury or performance. So we're going to look for painful movements. So these would be the zeros on the screen, and these are the movements that we'll train around. We're going to look for movements that are outside of our acceptable range. So these would be ones on the movement screen. And we have to remember here that normal movement is a range. So we're not looking for perfect, we're looking for good enough to load. And we're not worrying about the composite score out of 21 because it really doesn't mean anything. Lastly, we're looking for glaring asymmetries. So a little bit of asymmetry is normal. Our bodies are asymmetrical, but we're looking for really big deviations, like if you had a 3 on one side of an inline lunge and a 1 on the other, because these are things that could impact our exercise execution. And then we're remembering that the functional movement screen or any other screen out there is just a lens. We don't want to marry ourselves to any one particular guru or system because nobody and nothing's right 100% of the time. We're just using it to learn from it, and then we're going to move on to customizing our screen once we have more experience. When we are creating our customized screen, we want to be thinking about choosing tests that matter to us and to our client population and our programming. So when we're deciding how many tests to use, it's going to come down to how much time that we have and how comprehensive we need to be. So how much information do we need in order to inform our programming? And more information is only going to be better if we're actually going to use it. So I've seen screens that are good that are just 3 movements. I've seen screens that are good that are 7, and I've seen screens that are good that are 16. It just depends, and only you as the personal trainer can know what's going to work best for your client population and for your programming needs. A few tests that I like are a single leg squat because it has important implications for anybody who's running, considering that every step when you're running is basically a ballistic single leg squat. I also like a one-leg glute bridge because it tells me how well the person controls the transverse plane and how well their hip extensors are working. I like a hip hinge because that's a movement that I'm definitely going to be attempting to load in the training sessions. And for my more advanced athletes or my more advanced clients, I'll be looking at something like a drop jump because that shows me how well the person can control the frontal plane, looking at their ankle, knee, and hip. When we are creating our own screen, we have to remember that these global movements are providing a lot of information at once. A lot of joints are moving, and if they're moving well, that can check a lot of boxes. But if there's a limitation, these movements don't tell us exactly where that limitation is occurring or why. It could be a mobility issue, it could be a stability or control issue, it could be the novelty of the task, which just gets better with practice, or it could be some actual anatomical restriction. So in order to figure out which of these things is, we have to do what we call breakout tests. So breakout tests help you figure out where the limitation is, and then that helps us to effectively program around the limitation. So the initial screen really just tells us what we need to dig down deeper into. For example, if you look at this overhead squat, we're not sure if it's an ankle issue, whether it's a hip issue, a shoulder issue, or a T-spine issue. So we can use breakout tests to measure ankle dorsiflexion. We can look at hip flexion in quadruped. We can look at shoulder flexion standing against a wall. And so if the issue is at the ankle, then we could use box squats or squat with a heel lift so we don't have to go into as much dorsiflexion. Maybe they don't have the shoulder flexion range of motion, and we'll just use a goblet squat in that case. And maybe they don't have the hip flexion range of motion, and that just means that for now we're going to be allowing them to squat a little bit higher than we might like. If they don't have any limitations in these breakout tests, then that tells us that it's not the parts that are the problem, but it's just the coordination thereof. So they need to work on their stability, or they just need more practice. When we're administering the screen, we want to be careful to be consistent. So we want to be consistent with our verbal instructions and our visual demonstrations. We want to say the same thing every time, because if we don't, then we might be eliciting a movement that is different because of something that we said, not because of the actual way that the person moves. So that's one thing. The other thing with the visual demonstration, the FMS standardizes their procedure by not demonstrating the movements. I think that's short-sighted because some people are visual learners, and that would put them at a major disadvantage if they couldn't see the movement. They might not understand what you're asking them to do. So you could just demonstrate the movement for the person, but that's going to bias them towards the way that you are moving. And so I recommend having a booklet of images showing the starting and ending positions for each movement, or you could also show them a video. Also, when we're administering the screen, I like to score it two ways. So the first way is what I call the instinctive performance. And this would be how the person performs the movement naturally without any coaching or cueing. This is where the FMS stops, but I like to take it one step further. If you remember back to what I said about the firefighters who were able to change their performance with knowledge of the scoring criteria, we can use this information to our advantage. So what I would do from there is I would coach them up a little bit. So I would see if they could improve their performance based on my cue. And this would tell me what they have the capacity to do as their best performance. So maybe they are not squatting as deep as I want them to go, and so I would note that, and I would score it, and then I would say, hey, can you squat any deeper? And I would score that too. So I would note that they got a 1 just naturally or instinctively, but their best performance with some cueing was a 2. Another thing that I could do would be to modify some of the positions to remove a little bit of the challenge. So maybe I would let them change their foot position, or I would change the position of the PVC rod from overhead to a front rack. And I would say, let's say for the inline lunge, they scored a 1, but when I let them widen their base of support, they got a 2. The other thing that I think is important is just to use your head and not rigidly adhere to the directions, because let's say that you have an older client or a really young athlete or an overweight client, and you know that they're not going to be able to do a push-up on the floor. Well, there's no sense having them get on the floor and fail at the push-up when you could just start them on an incline and have them do the push-up. And if it turns out that they rock at push-ups, then you can go to the floor, but we don't need to have them try something if we are pretty sure that they're going to fail at it. When we're discussing the results of the screen with our clients, we want to remember that it's not our job as personal trainers to fix people, especially of issues that they didn't even come to you complaining of. Our job is to help them get leaner and stronger, and to simultaneously help them to move better. So if I'm talking about the results of the screen, I might say something like this. I'm going to use positive and empowering language. I'll say, the way that your knees tracked during the squat isn't the strongest position for reducing force. Don't worry though, I see this all the time and we can clean it right up. Not, you're a walking sack of dysfunction just waiting to get injured. When we're talking about the results, we want to reinforce the body's resilience and encourage movement, not create fear of it. We don't want the person to think that they're frail. So telling them that they're at increased risk of injury, which we don't even know for sure, isn't a great way to get them to move more. It would probably make them move less. So we want to be careful with our language. Now that we've screened them once at intake, and we've gone through, let's say, a 4-week program, we have the opportunity to rescreen them and to compare their current performance to their baseline performance. I think that's a reasonable approach, but I do see a few issues with it. First, practice effects. So we know that people get better with practice. Are we seeing just the fact that the person has practiced this movement before and that's the reason why they're getting better? The other thing that we have to be careful of is expectancy bias. So this would be finding what we're looking for. If we've worked with them for a period of 1 month and we've trained them, then we're naturally going to subconsciously see that they've improved, even if they maybe have not. And then the last thing is that getting better at the test really isn't the goal. The goal of training is to get healthier and stronger and more fit. So while it's nice to be able to document measurable improvements in movement quality, clients usually don't care about that stuff. So I think that the formal screen at intake is enough. And from there, it's good enough just to track improvements informally from session to session. So this is what I talked about before, the informal screen, where we're using each session as a continual screen for exercise performance and how the person feels. And we're going to use this stream of information to determine when to progress the exercise variations. The one scenario that I would say that it's important to screen again is after a long layoff or an injury, because we want to see that the person's at least back to their baseline, if not better. Let's say the client they're a runner and they had plantar fasciitis on one foot. We want to make sure that they're back to symmetrical performance if they came to us with symmetrical performance, because that could be indicative, if they're not, that they are not fully recovered. And then if the layoff has been long for any other reason, we're basically creating a new baseline when we screen again. Cliff Notes version, I think that new trainers should use an existing movement screen and experienced trainers should customize their screen and include breakout testing. When we're administering the screen, we want to determine both instinctive and best performance and use positive language when explaining the results. So if you remember back to what I said about how unloaded movements don't guarantee that loaded movement will also look good, we want to be looking at loaded movement too. So in addition to just the movement screen, we're also going to be, as part of our assessment process, asking about injury history and performance testing. So whereas the movement screen looks at their qualitative movement, the performance testing looks at their objective or quantitative measurements. In particular, we'll be looking at dynamic balance, strength, power, and conditioning. With the injury history, a lot of times, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, we'll have a client come in and we'll ask them if they've ever been injured, and they say no. Then when we go to do something overhead, they raise one arm all the way up and the other one goes up to about 90 degrees of shoulder abduction. Lo and behold, they forgot to mention that they tore their rotator cuff 10 years ago. So a trick that I got from a chiropractor was to give people a skeleton and say, please circle your previously injured areas, and with those circles of those areas, describe the injury, including the date, what happened, and how recovered you are from it. So that's how I get around the mystery of the injury history. Then we'll conduct the movement screen of choice, and we'll move on to the performance testing. So with the dynamic balance, we can do it a few ways. I really like the Y balance, which the FMS has a kit for, but you can also just put tape on the floor and measure the distances. I also like, for the upper body, a similar test. You could also, if you didn't want to look at dynamic balance, you could just look at static balance, have a person balance on one leg with their eyes open and their eyes closed, and see how long they can balance. 20 seconds is usually a good benchmark to aim for. With performance measures of strength, I'm typically looking at a 5RM or a number of max reps in a push-up, maybe a bent arm hang for time. In addition to noting the load and the reps, I'm also looking at the quality of the movement. So I'm in particular looking at rep 1 compared to rep 5 because that tells me how fatigue affects their movement. This is basically just the movement screen with added load. We can look at the same movements and see how they compare to the body weight condition. For power, I might look at a seated medicine ball throw for distance or a single leg broad jump for distance. You could also do a double leg broad jump or you could do a vertical jump. These are giving me opportunities to look at how the person moves quickly, so at high velocity, which we know differs from low velocity or slow movements. And then in addition to just noting those distances, I'm also noting the quality of movement. For conditioning, I like a 2.5 mile bike ride for time. This usually takes somewhere from 5 to 8 minutes, or a 6-minute shuttle run for distance if it's right for the client and you have the setup to do that. If you remember back to the pyramid that I showed earlier, each of these steps are really the first 3 rungs of the pyramid. So the injury history is looking at musculoskeletal function, the movement screen is looking at movement patterns, and then performance tests are for performance. I'll leave the skill to somebody who specializes in whatever target activity the person is engaging in outside the gym. So to recap, movement screening is neither useless nor a cure-all. It shouldn't be used to predict injury or performance, but it should be used to establish a baseline of movements that can be loaded or that cause pain. And it's just one piece of a comprehensive assessment. With that, I would like to acknowledge my mentors, Barry Fritz, Carl Safran, Kevin Nield, David Lanier, Matt Sees, Chris Leib, Elspeth Vino, Robert Polka, Scott Morrison, and lots of others I'm forgetting who I've had many a conversation about movement screening over the years. Here are my references, and with that, you should be able to accomplish these objectives. Feel free to leave a question for me in the comments, and I would be happy to answer them. Thank you for watching.